Bienvenidos. I am CHERRÍE Moraga, and I'm the co-director of Las Maestras Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. And that is with CELIA Rodriguez, who may do a little sneak appearance today, I hope. And this is, of course, Roberto Lovato, and it is really a pleasure to be here with you, Roberto. We have to do it in front of a crowd, I guess, to see each other, because I haven't seen you in many, many years. And
yeah, but you look great and feels great. Like the work you're doing here with Las Maestras looks so promising and beautiful.
Gracias, gracias. It's really good to see you. Does my heart good. So I will tell people who aren't aware of Roberto's work. I've known his work for a long, long time, and it's really, in terms of selecting the people for this public voice, he is somebody who has done his work in terms of really making Latinx, Latino, Latina, all of us have a visibility that it's almost singular in the way that he has done it. So let me give you a little bit of his own background. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsors, Chicano Studies Institute, the Department of English, the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, the Multicultural Center. And one of the reasons why we have started this four-person series, this four-writer series, is really to make visible what we believe to be, during this period of time, a lack of visibility of Latino expression in the news. After all the stuff that's been going on this summer, a plague, there have been progressive public protests, right-wing revolt hits the streets, the capital of this nation, and we're asking ourselves, where was the Latinx voice in all of that arena? And so partly this is our contribution today to kind of fill in some of those blanks. But most importantly, too, what I feel like one of the things that for me as a writer is really, really important is to look at the writers that I feel like are really making very, very particular contributions in, I feel, probably the most progressive way possible, which is to be able to write in a way that is both personal and political, that has that puts the individual in the thrust of critical institutional questions. And Roberto, this is his new book that just came out in 2020, The Unforgetting, a Memoir of Family, Migration, Gangs, and Revolution in the Americas, is exactly that. It was published by Harper Collins, which is no easy feat to get that publisher, and was picked by the New York Times as an editor's choice. Newsweek listed the memoir as a must-read 2020 book, and the LA Times named it one of its 20 best books of the year. Lovato is an educator, a journalist, and a writer based at the Writers Grotto in San Francisco. He's a recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center. He has reported on numerous issues all through, especially the Northern Triangle area, but also through other parts of Latin America and the United States and other countries. And he's the co-founder of Dignidad Literaria, which I hope we are able to talk about somewhat. Mm-hmm. As a journalist, Roberto has worked tirelessly to make public this Latinx experience, and this book is exemplary in this regard, for it absolutely embodies the best intention of a public voice, as well as the intention of this series, which is, through the lens of I, in the name of we, Lovato makes visible the invisible population changing the face and mind of the United States of North America. In this case, the especially invisible face of Salvadoran Americans and the peoples and the political history of El Salvador is what he is filling in. The beauty of this book is that somehow it achieves a profound intimacy, even as it exposes decades of genocidal violence and historical trauma on a scale nearly impossible to assimilate into one's ser, one's being. And that's where I want to start. I have to say that this book, and I feel like the book, my students and I teach a graduate course called Latinx Public Voice, as the title of our series here, and it has taken us on quite a journey, and I think that it is to speak of the courage that it took for you to write this book. to me is a really phenomenal thing. And I knew you from before, but I know that this is really the culmination, for you in many, many ways of really going to, it's like going broad and going deep, but also putting El Salvador on the literary map, which is your intention, and political map, of course, So I think that you start with this incredible metaphor, which is the machete, right? The machete of memory. And you write, the machete of memory can cut swiftly or slowly. And my experience of it was that the pace of that cutting increases and increases as we go through the book. So maybe you can talk, start with that and tell us why that metaphor, and also for the people that are not aware of it, what are these really sites of suffering that the nation has gone through?
Well, before anything, I need to thank you, CHERRÍE, and CELIA for inviting me, and for the staff and people with Las Maestras. I'm honored and humbled to be here with you, a writer I've respected, a writer who you forgot in my intro to mention that was my neighbor in the Mission on Bessie Street.
That's right.
Right, you were on Bessie Street. I was down the street on Folsom in the Mission on 25th, where I grew up, next to the projects on what used to be Army Street.
Right.
And I also wrote my first magazine article about you back in the day.
Yeah.
So, and I admired you as a writer then, and I've just been wonderful to see you kind of keep evolving. Even, at this stage of our games, we're still in it. We're still at it. So,
well, thank you for that. I appreciate saying
and
that.
I appreciate you, CHERRÍE.
We were neighbors, right?
Yeah.
They're going to think this is, this series is kind of like something about, like in San Gabriel, I was like neighbors with Luis, and now I'm neighbors with you in San Francisco. So
nepotistic brown people. That's how we're going to be interpreted. It's just going to be.
All right, está bien.
If they're going to interpret us that way, then they won't listen to us. But for those that want to listen, the book Unforgetting is about a series of underworld journey, an underworld journey into different underworlds. Yeah. Right, at one level. At another level, the top level, which is the present, it's about my search to understand what makes El Salvador and the United States so violent. What turns children into killers? So as a journalist, I tracked, the evolution of MS-13, and as an activist, I also engaged with younger members back in the day when the gangs were starting in LA to grow into a new kind of more structured form in the 90s. But as I said, at the deeper level, it's a journey into different underworlds that I'm trying to connect. The underworld of my dad's history, which was secret. If you go into my dad's living room and my mom's living room, all my mom's family was in this living room. Abuelita, tías, tíos, cousin's dog, cousin's dog's dog.
The dog's dog.
The dog's dog. Everybody was in it. But in my father's case, there was only one picture in the whole house. And that was of my abuelita, Mamate, my grandmother. And so my dad had this kind of veil of secrecy about his own family. And I always I like Detective Columbo. For those of you that are old enough to remember Columbo, he was a disheveled detective, and I was a little kind of detective combination, Columbo and Mr. Peabody, the traveling dog that my friends called me because I was a bookworm. So I was really into researching my family's history because I knew that the half-dead feeling that the poet Roque Dalton talks about, that's what I felt. When I first heard that phrase, I was like, whoa. So I knew that it had something to do with my dad. And so there's underworld journey into there. There's underworld journey of my family history, the underworld journey of my own kind of secrets and shame in life. And then my overcoming that and, thinking about others and moving into the world of politics and eventually revolutionary politics as a former member of the FMLN guerrillas. And then the underworld journey of the gangs that I go into these really crazy secret hideouts that they had that reminded me of the war when we had our secret hideouts. And then the underworld of nations, really, which is kind of one of the main points for me is, our lives are made possible and made miserable by nations many times, but we forget that. And so nations are built up on forgetting. So I went into the underworlds to excavate that and come out with whatever I could of the goods of the larger truths that are hidden in the underworlds.
And how would you define those? I mean, how can you name those larger truths?
One of them is that we start off with a tenderness in life as children. Mm-hmm. And over time, nations and families, people in our lives, our fathers, even our mothers sometimes, and others can make us almost less tender and make us lose the tenderness. And then when you start growing more and you start encountering, like young Black and Latino kids are, encountering now, that you encounter the state in the form of the police. And, we just celebrated the justice brought to one cop. And so the truth is that the tenderness often gets lost in the terror. And so the book for me was a way to rescue in my own life, but also I think in the larger arena of policy and everything, of the tenderness that has to be the part of any solution to any social issue at this point. Tenderness towards the planet. We're on Earth Day, right? Right. Tenderness towards other species. Tenderness towards our own people. Tenderness towards ourselves. And so the relationship between the tenderness and the terror is very strong in the world we live in, as is the relationship between the intimate and the epic and the intimate. They're both very, and we don't have an epic sense of ourselves. So these are kind of the bigger truths that I wanted to kind of get at.
Well, the work is, it's interesting too, because I remember you wrote elsewhere about sort of your fascination with Brecht, right? And his epic theater, Yeah. And this work is, yes, it could be a film, but it could be an incredible epic stage work as well, I mean, the sense that and the thing about Brecht too is that he didn't want anybody, it was like the whole point of it is to retain your consciousness that you are watching a work, that you are politically aware through the whole, you don't get to just go, I feel so bad, like, because it's theater. It isn't that.
Right.
It's really, the epic is that you are actually, not only the grandness of the story, but also that you are constantly politically aware, reminded of the injustice as you're looking through these, as you're following the storyline, right? And this is the thing about, I guess too, that there were things I didn't know. Right. I mean, I knew them because I in the 80s too. I mean, I was in the mission district. That's where we lived, right? And it's like, and so my relationship to Salvadoreños was, everybody was Salvadoreño. The Latinos were Salvadoreño. I mean,
the majority of the Latinos in the mission were Salvadoreños.
No, absolutely, right? And so I found out when I went to go get Mexican food at Salvadoran restaurants, and anyway, it was different. But but that sense about, I remember that period of time, and I was very well aware of it, and Carecen and all of those great artists that were coming through, that were, coming from El Salvador, folks that were FMLN people, were then coming into the mission. It was alive with all of this, right? Alive with this sense about that there was really revolutionaries walking on the street with you.
Real
right?
revolutionaries.
Real revolutionaries, yes.
Not Bernie.
No, not Bernie. But it was something that so what I'm saying though, but some of the detalles, like some of the things like of really, and I would like you to speak a little bit to that, so that 1932, right, it's 1932 massacre, right? La Matanza.
Yeah.
It's like that I knew about it, but somehow in reading your book and then the Mazote one too, like there are these three really significant massacres that in the reading of it, and it's also really a credit to your writing, because I am feeling it viscerally in a way that it just seemed I have I have to show people. Okay, people need to mark their books, right? Okay, so, but also I have like a little story here, and I'm gonna read to you right now, okay?
Right.
This is what it looks like, people. So write in your books. This was on February 14th, I guess Valentine's Day. This is a book of love. By the last chapter, the sadness, the sufrimiento becomes almost too much to bear. and I am only Lovato's humble and ignorant reader. What lessons he has taught me in the writing, the courage of his inquiries, both intimate and bloodily institutional. I am grateful, so grateful, and I am humbled by the breadth and depth of the task he completed here in the name of a people, un pueblo, mestizo y indígena. How could one small nation be allowed such constant cruelties? Without history, we can have no hope, the book tells us. And so it is. Roberto has offered his people, even those who may never read this work, hope. He has done his ancestors proud. I'm just telling you, this is the conversation in this book that you offer to us, that we don't walk around and be ignorant of our history, and also are shared as, Mexicanos, like here, it's like this notion of Latinx, and yet each of us have our specific history of colonization, of brutality, and we were all, we all have 500 years of conquest in our DNA, So this book, in that way, that if we can speak to, and I'm glad you brought up the beautiful poem of Dalton at the end, right? To that 1932 moment. And what I wrote down in my own notes was like the birth of a nation, meaning that nation state. When you're talking about those nations and how we that our vulnerability or our tenderness is lost because of the nation state, right? And that felt to me like this key moment, because you also talk about that was a time in which indigenous people went underground, began to be so traumatized and afraid to be indígenas, to be identified as indígenas, because they would be pointed out and they'd be slaughtered. So can you speak to that moment?
Yeah, I'm glad you.
From there.
Well, I was hoping you'd keep talking a little bit, because your reading of your notes in the book had me choking up. So I didn't want to kind of lose my cool, so to speak, and the very macho male here before you, But seriously, no, I was very touched. Thank you, CHERRÍE.
Thank you. Yeah.
It was a very difficult journey to go into all these underworlds, because they're all connected, right? My dad has this big secret at the heart of our family, really, in many ways, alongside the other part of the heart, which is my mom's kind of lifting up of ourselves and of our family, despite it all. And those are kind of the two forces, almost of gravity and levity, that I grew up with, right? And levity is not lightweight. Levity means just to lighten up and lift, which is an energy we need in desperate ways at this moment in world history on Earth Day, right? We need levity like never before, whether it's the power of the light or the power of lightness and the power to laugh, despite it all, right? And so, I had to go in there, and I find out that my dad is one of the last living survivors and witnesses of what scholars at Oxford, like Anders Sandberg, told me was one of the most singularly violent episodes, because it lasted weeks, episodes in not just Salvadoran history, not just Latin American history, but in world history, in terms of the number of people killed per day, per week, in a concentrated space, something like 10, 20, 30, maybe 50,000 people. We don't know, because the Salvadoran state, whether it's fascist like it is now, or with the HERRERA party, or leftist like it was with my former compañeros in the FMLN, they don't want to dig those bones up. Yeah. And to the degree that you don't dig up the bones of your past is the degree that history tells us you're destined to repeat it, sadly. You don't get a Donald Trump without forgetting. I also argue that you don't get a Barack Obama, the mass deporter, the one who introduced the caging of children, the separation of children from their mothers. You don't get that, and you don't get him riding out on a horse and being in today he's there with Ava DuVernay, yesterday talking about giving advice to organizers. I mean, this is like the degree of cynicism and lies that we have to overcome. And the fascist turn is just kind of a cover for the deeper problems with capitalism. And so I went hard as I tend to go in my life. I mean, I go hard. I learned that from my mom. My mom has taught me to go hard. My mom taught me to look at death.
Yeah.
And to try to, to learn that fearlessness is not the absence of fear, but just learning to live with it. My mom had, as I described in the book, these little bracelets with kind of from Halloween with skulls on them. And I said, Mama, ¿por qué tiene eso? Why do you have that? Well, para recordarme que todos vamos a morir. To remind myself that we're all going to die.
Yeah.
And so with a mother like that and with a history like the one I lived through, and then growing up in San Francisco in the 70s, but born in the 60s, but raised in the 70s, when San Francisco was like a magical place with psychedelic culture, hippies, Santana, Black Power, Brown Power, Cesar Chavez on 25th, on Bryant Street, Dolores Huerta. I mean, and kind of, different currents of consciousness coming through San Francisco. That's kind of, those are things that shaped me to do what I was born to do, as you said in this book. Because, I had to actually, it was hard to get it published by a big publisher and to do it on my own terms. And one of my own terms was making sure that the intensity of El Salvador and the violence, the guerrilla stuff and the violence of the gangs and the governments doesn't lose track of the fact that I'm a kid from the mission on Folsom Street that was your neighbor, on Bessie Street, because the industry will tropicalize us if we allow it. And so those tropicalizations, those stereotypes that define us in the culture, in literature, in film, in music, are the stuff of death, really, I think, if we allow it. Because I learned in El Salvador one thing that I'll never, ever forget, which is that in order to kill somebody like the Death Squad founder, Roberto Lovato, would come out on TV and he would denounce the people. And then a day or so later, or a few days later, those people would end up not just dead, but hacked to pieces in the most horrific way. So in order to pass bad policies against people like children, like what Barack Obama and Donald Trump did, in order to kill people, you have to deny them their humanity. So that, as I like to say, telling our stories, rescuing our humanity is a militant and absolutely necessary act right now.
Well, and that's you asked the question later, and Roberto and I, we had some correspondence before this via email, and I said, well, what would you want to talk about? What are your questions, right? And partly the question was, what is the role of literature? What is the role of art making right now? Why does it matter, right? Yeah. And it is just that, it's like, and sometimes it can feel like, you're like, because it's this, particularly because writing is a private act, right? You do it by yourself, and you're wondering, like, and all the risk taking you're doing in your, kind of inside of you, and you're wondering to whom and to what, but it is absolutely that relationship,
Well, you taught some of us to do this, to be honest. There's 4 words that I still remember to this day that you wrote. I don't remember where. I think it was in the play, Shadow of a Man. I think it was, yo existo, existo yo.
Sí.
So CHERRÍE Moraga went Descartes. Basically, I exist. Yeah. And to affirm that, the centrality of that, back then when you wrote that, and now, as Latinx peoples, we especially have to affirm that we exist. Because if you don't know it, you live in a country that in which the elites are bent on erasing your existence because you're not cómodos. You don't make people comfortable in a country that still wants to perceive itself in these black and white terms, right? In terms of the what some call the black-white binary, And so if we have, this racial dialogue in the country right now, it just systematically erases, as you see in literature, film, in Sunday talk shows, in the media, even on the issue of immigration. This is the first book by Salvadorans, about Salvadorans, published by one of the big 5 in U.S. history. It's not because I'm special but because I managed to conspire and strategize my ass into
That's about it.
into the system, because I'm a strategist and a conspirator perpetually. And
Well, it's
so-
interesting. I want to tell you about two things, right? Okay, one, I do want to get back to the black-white, paradigm, sort of, But I also want to share my experience with you of getting my book, Native Country of the Heart, published by actually a brother-sister company, under Macmillan, right? Which is Farrar, Strass, and Giroux.
FSG.
And, yeah. And one of the things, it was very hard, and I had a good representative that was, struggling for me and getting me in there after lots of back and forth. But one of the most interesting things that happened to me in that process is that the editor that I was working with, the senior editor, we were, she read everything. She had read it at various versions, and then finally it was, they bought it, they got it, right? And we're having this long conversation on the phone, many hours, and but before, just as we're beginning, she says, well, I recommend this change, and you were talking about, what are your bottom lines, right? This change, this and I go, oh, no, I can't change that. And then she goes, and there's something I thought, oh, no, you can't change that, like that. And then I said, and each time I'd say no, I'd say why? I said, no, that's because Chicanos, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's because California, da-da-da-da. That's because, and it's class, race, culture, all of that, right? And the beauty of it was that, and this is to this woman's credit, and it's like, it's the best thing she could have said. She said to me, she goes, okay, let's stop. She says, my worldview is no bigger than the circumference of New York City and how many boroughs are there? 5? Or I forget how many boroughs there are. And she says, so why don't we start again? So we can decide which is my cultural ignorance, and what really I can do to help you, in it. And I thought that was the most beautiful thing a person could say. And you see, that is the point. The point is that, as Latino people, right, it's like we are just off the map, right? We are off the literary map. And, so kind of back to that question then, and I think it's a very delicate question, or it's like it's dangerous territory that in the period with COVID and Black Lives Matter and all of that, and how we were so unrepresented in the conversation. And especially one of the things I miss is having a conversation with Black people, right? Entre Latinos and other people of color. I mean, it's like this bridge called My Back was about women of color feminism.
Audre Lorde and Kitchen Table Press.
Exactly. And so suddenly we're not in conversation. Suddenly it's white people talking to Black people. And that was also making its way into the university, that suddenly it's just a black-white conversation. And it was hard to talk about, because then people would begin to think it's about ranking oppressions, right? And so what are your feelings about that? And sort of how do you maneuver that?
Well, I think in any process of social change, the first thing that I tend to go to is affirmation of what and who I and we are. If we don't affirm that, and we don't have the self-knowledge to then have the dream ripple outward, then we're screwed. So you have to have I feel like we have to have a firm sense of ourselves to then go into the world and kind of make solidarity. My approach is old school. I'm not really conversant in some of the discourse around race that has taken these forms that erase Latinx peoples. That even has some Latinx people erasing our own people, putting on the back, speaking of this bridge called My Back, putting on the back of working class people who are, all this heavy stuff and responsibility for things that are societal ills across the board. So I think solidarity is a good place. I mean, we have to, thank goodness, thank Jehovah, thank whoever your God of choice for the Black prophetic tradition, the Black radical politic that has brought us to this stage in U.S. history right now. Yep. It has helped us define democracy. And we just have to acknowledge that as whatever we are. But we also have to prepare ourselves for the most epic struggle of our lifetimes, thanks to, again, we're in Earth Day 2021, climate change. So I approach it, I don't approach race from a neoliberal perspective. I think there's a lot of neoliberal discourse about what being Latino means and what being Black means. When we lose sight of the radical tradition, the prophetic traditions, we're going to lend ourselves to the ideas of race given to us, fed, forced upon us by the system that's now creating what I call an intersectional empire. Whereas empire is now learning how to use, the statue of Martin Luther King to then go bomb Libya or to jail, separate and kill Central American children, as happened under Obama and Trump, and it's happening with Biden. So I think we need to, but we need to go back to the concepts like solidarity between. We're not going to get to the promised land through the racial and suffering Olympics. We're going to get there with good old school solidarity where we both agree, or all of us agree, that's our adversary. And the adversary is clear. Look again, climate change is the greatest opportunity to educate ourselves about the greatest evil on earth, capitalism, that has literally destroyed the life-sustaining systems of the planet. If we don't deal with that, all our race discussion, everything else. So I proceed forth from a Southern perspective, the peoples of the South. Because, we are, even those of us that are brown or Black, we're imperial citizens compared to the people in the South where I've spent a lot of time reporting and sometimes fighting with. So that's how I approach it. I approach it with a global lens, a lens of solidarity. But this specialized language that people are using around race and the Olympics around it is just like,
Well, I think it gets it also too. I think for kind of coming of age in a different political time, and one of the things I remembered so much about when I was sort of coming to a certain set of consciousness was about that we identified ourselves as third world people in the U.S. Right, and there was something about that. Right, el mundo, es tercermundistas, tercermundistas, right? Because it put us then in touch with the third world, the so-called third world. That there was, so the whole issue of it was immediately sort of like anti-globalism, right? Globalization, because it was a progressive response, right, to that we are all connected by virtue of being from the global South, really, right? And so when this there's something that's been lost in that. I mean, that's what I find so confusing, and that I feel like that there is just that our current conversations, that people are very quick to language, that there's so much language now, and then and yet I find this also as a teacher, teaching college age people, that's like they have all the language, and you're going, but what's underneath it? Do you know what the history is behind it, et cetera? So the thing, I'm curious too, just about when you were talking about, what exactly then when you're talking about that you feel like that the language is not holding up, and that the discussions aren't happening. To me, partly of it for me is that I feel like it's very, very easy, and this is neoliberal, to very easily get kind of interested in talking to white people. In other words, that it's like the lens begins to move away from each other, because now suddenly MSNBC wants to interview you, and that, all these, and that suddenly I see the conversation is like, oh, well, there is goods by talking to white people. There is benefit. It's like you get, there's, and we're talking about capitalism. So the whole time I'm thinking there's something about this commodification of Blackness, commodification of race, commodification of all this that works perfectly, with, what you're talking about, the neoliberal agenda.
Yeah, that's why one of the reasons I wrote the book was to kind of share what, for me, was one of the best and most important political experiences of my life, the revolutionary experience.
Yeah.
Again, not Bernie's. I love Bernie, but this was old school kind of Che Guevara, Latin American revolutionary movements, pre-Zapatista, like people I know trained the Zapatistas, who took the revolutionary sensibility and gave it a communications turn. And so when I talk about solidarity, the solidarity between Salvadorans and Mexicans,
right,
in the revolutionary sense, or the solidarity like one of the people in my stories, G, one of the great loves of my life, and she taught me a lot. She was a diplomat, so I got to be a fly on the wall with all these revolutionary organizations from the Philippines, the Polisario Front that was fighting against Ethiopia and Africa, and I was offered. I didn't get to follow up on it because I had something else I needed to do. But I could have actually learned to intervene in financial systems from some Lebanese folks who are in solidarity with us.
Yeah.
I've never said that publicly, and maybe but there it is.
There it is.
And so these are acts of solidarity across the world that show not just talk about something, but actually sharing resources, acknowledging the common adversary, and agreeing to fight jointly for the greater good. It's kind of simple and old school, and I think we need to get to that point where, we have kind of that epic sensibility, a prophetic sense of struggle to face a prophetically troubled world that we have right now. And that's where I see this intersectional empire is playing a role to
When you
deaden.
say the intersectional empire, what do you mean?
I mean, like, empire learned to bring in, hey, let's celebrate that Kamala Harris is going to be the person responsible for Central American policy and going to go to the root causes. Well, I mean, I'm a journalist. I go and I look, who's she talking to? Who's she bringing onto her team? She's bringing on a guy named Ricardo Zúñiga, who's a descendant of a military dictatorship fascist family in Honduras. And who, as an advisor, he's specialized in national security and destabilizing all the governments in Latin America that were turned left. So, I mean, she's surrounding herself with people like this guy and others. And the solutions they're proposing are the same formula, which is neoliberal economics backed up by militarized policing and actual militaries, right? Which the two are fusing, right? We're at a time when policing and militaries are becoming one. We just don't see it.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So they're militarizing the interior of the U.S. because,
That's exactly what's happening.
we don't use the term third world anymore, but if you look at our inner cities, big finance and big technology in San Francisco and around the United States has started making places in the United States, pockets of urban United States and rural United States, look like America Latina. We're becoming a southern country in many ways.
Absolutely.
But there lies the opportunity, because we can learn a lot. One of the great centers of world revolution was America Latina. Across the board, it's demonstrated its ability to fight back against U.S. imperialism time and again. I mean, there's incredible stories of women, men,
Of course.
who've struggled against it. So that's for me. And the Caribbean. I mean,
Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
So I remain actually very, very optimistic in many ways, given what's happening in the world, because COVID, climate change, all these things are sweeping away the illusions of intersectional empire that's going to put queer people in the cabinet. It's going to put
I know. Yes.
all this identity politic being used to justify and legitimate the same exploitative, murderous policy.
See, this seems so evident. I mean, like you're talking. This seems absolutely evident, and yet it's like I think like that, like they're like these little diablitos in the road, like, oh, come here, little girl, come here, that and partly I feel like it's because of this belief in the nation state, that everybody just believes in, we're American, and we're from Latinos to Black to Asian. It's like that somehow, because we are, the whole thing about American exceptionalism is like, that's like the Kool-Aid that everybody's drinking, so you want a piece of it. And yet on a deeply personal level, right? Every little familia and their struggle and everything, I get it, like everybody, it's we're pretty well dressed here. We're doing pretty good, right? And so but the point of it is that it used to be like, I remember years ago when I went to Mexico, you talk to the cab driver and they had it all. They knew they could break down all transnational capital, everything else. The languages are gone. I mean, they're like leaving us, that this critique. And in the book, you make clear that the machete is the border. You know, I mean, that is, because that's cutting, it's cutting America. It's cutting America up. And for you to believe in that, like, to have the America with the accent, I just keep holding on,
Yeah, the machete of memory.
Yes.
The ultimate machete of memory in the book, and in my belief, is the border.
Is the border.
And we have to reckon with the border and with the capitalist system that creates it in order to block us off from the peoples of the South, but also from our history, the history of the United States. This book is as much about the United States as it is about El Salvador and what it means.
You have that great quote in there. Like I don't like to lose the thing because I just want to talk with you. But about what you're saying, this is the United States, right? I mean, it's like that. This is the, I wish you probably know your book better than me. But it's just like that. Even when you, and also maybe you could talk to a little bit about even the relationship, what happened with with all of the gang violence being exported to El Salvador. Well, who's responsible for that, right? And then, and what happens to, you're talking about going back to the idea also of the tenderness being lost, right? And you're also talking about, like, and Luis mentioned this a lot, about this fierce masculinity, right? Hyper masculinity, right? Where that tenderness is, the last thing you're supposed to touch, So can you speak a little bit more about that, about the United States relationship to, fighting gang warfare and all of those kind of mythologies that are.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I lived for many years in L.A. After the war. I came back to live in L.A. I worked in, and then I led CARECEN, Central American Refugee Center, and then Resource Center. And I was there right in time to see a few things of epic importance for Salvadorans. First, the peace accords in 92. The year 92 was an epic year for us. The peace accords ending 12 years of one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Western Hemisphere ended. And then in April 92, April 29, Rodney King riots. And CARECEN and Central Americans are in the center of Pico Union, and many lived in South Central LA. So it forced us to kind of look, because our gaze was focused on El Salvador and the war and all that implied. And then the riots just kind of came and boom. And one of the things that happened during the riot was that the gang started getting more, escalating their violence for different reasons, not least of which they were being, kind of pressured by, from the east, by the Mexican mafia and larger gangs that were better armed with, and then the Crips and the Bloods. And so there's, you start seeing the Salvadoran gangs starting to take on more of the structures and the rituals of the larger gangs, tattooed and dressed. It used to be, remember, MS-13 started off as Mara Salvatrucha stoners. They were stoners, long-haired, listening to Ronnie James Dio over on Normandy and, and in different parts of Pico Union. And, suddenly then, one of the most entrepreneurial entities in our lives to this day are the police. They're always looking for opportunities, just like the military, because they have to justify these massive budgets. Right. So the entrepreneurial spirit of the police goes and finds these kids who are using machetes to defend themselves because they can't afford Uzis and AK-47s, which are the preferred weapons of some of the larger gangs. Right. So then suddenly Lisa Ling and LAPD and eventually politicians start shaping this story of this most dangerous gang in the world, which has no statistical basis. There's nothing to show that the homicide rates, like in San Francisco last year, in 2019, I called police, in 2020, I called police departments around the United States in all the places where MS-13 operates. And, LA, Houston, Long Island, Alexandria, Virginia, and other locations. And asking them, well, what's the homicide rate for MS-13 in your region? You know, some of them got aggressive and didn't want to talk to me because these are like state secrets at this point. But the ones that did talk to me, like in San Francisco, Officer Portillo in the gang task force told me that in 2019, MS-13, which Trump was getting ready to declare terrorists, when I was doing this research, Officer Portillo told me, yeah, they've killed one, maybe two people in San Francisco, one of the main hubs of MS-13. In LA, you had similarly low statistics. In Long Island, where Trump and the reactionaries and even some Democrats have built up the story of MS-13 as being, you know, this really extremely violent and terrorist organization that deserves the RICO Act, right, which is kind of going after Al Capone and all these heavy, you know, El Chapo and had killed all of 5.5 people in the year 2019 and in the 10 years before. Their average. And so what I like to say is like there's a myth around MS-13 that affects all Salvadorans. And if you look at the homicide statistics, you're talking about a reality in which less than a handful of white supremacists with semi-automatic weapons now in a month in the United States have killed more people than all 10,000 MS-13 members that the FBI estimates are in the United States. And so you have this shadow play and this myth making that's being, you know, these entrepreneurs, you know, because entrepreneurs create stories. Like LA was created, like Mike Davis, our friend, says, you know, the boosterism of the elites created LA, right? They were creating this image of LA that fun and sun in the colonial kind of Spanish West.
Yeah.
So,
but then the whole issue too then of exporting all of those gang members, right? To El Salvador.
Exporting.
That's what it was, exporting.
Yeah.
But deporting that, and then it creates all of a whole different sort of, you know, culture going on then in El Salvador too, right? And so there's this, like, you know, as you call it, the gangs, guerrilleras, and government, right? That's sort of how you frame it, right? Talk a little bit about how all that interplay is with the United States sort of being, you know, the puppeteer and all of it.
Again, I can just point to LA. I mean, because half of all Salvadorans in the United States when I was living there lived in LA. So the numbers are still there. Pretty titanically high numbers. And so right after the riots, this William Barr, George Bush, the first attorney general before he was Trump's, saw an opportunity and he redeployed FBI resources to fight gangs because of the LA riots, and the greatest redeployment of FBI resources at that point in U.S. history. Wow. And so, you know, the state is looking at MS-13 and Salvadorans as an opportunity to help create a more of a police state by fighting gangs. And so, anyway, it wasn't just targeting MS-13, it was targeting the Crips, the Bloods, and other gangs, but it was a way to kind of get us on the road to increased militarization of communities. And then so then Barr goes and exports the policing models of LA and of LAPD and other increasingly militarized police to El Salvador. And so then, right after the peace accords, El Salvador didn't have a chance to breathe from militarism because the U.S. injected the drug war and anti-gang policing into a country that is overrun with guns exported by the United States, either by the government or the private sector. And so, getting back to your question, when you have a lot of guns in a place, it'll do something to the masculinity, something about guns and masculinity that are unhealthy for the planet and for its inhabitants, animal and human. And El Salvador taught me that. I could see it right after the war. And sadly, the United States, which has got tens of millions of guns circulating in the society now, is now seeing what it's like to be Salvadoran in that way. This is, again, part of the reason this isn't about just El Salvador. El Salvador offers an object lesson to the United States about, things like policing and militarization, but also about the struggle, the liberation struggles, the spirit, the tenderness that overcomes all of that history, awful history. That was, for me, one of the things. I didn't want to die without doing that, because I was privileged to see that story, to be able to see my people, myself, in a whole different way when I realized, because I was ashamed as a kid to be Salvadoran.
Yeah, you're right of this. Yeah.
And I think a lot of us are reared in the United States to be ashamed for different reasons, including where our parents are from and stuff. And so, but then, my tias, my mom, my abuelas, and other people started winning me over with, giving me, I'd go for Christmas to El Salvador and they'd give me this giant, basically a bomb like this thick and this big, because I was a pyromaniac from childhood. Wrapped in Christmas paper. That was their gift for me. They knew me. Lo vamos a ganar así. They were going to win this guy over like this. And it worked. As I started getting to being Salvadoreño more. And then, as I became political later, then I was in San Francisco. I was trying to do the Si Se Puede thing and, help support the UFW and, go boycott Cali Foods. You remember Cali Foods in the Mission? Sure. And then kind of the revolution started coming home in the form of family members and the history that I inhaled. Whoa. And, it's just lettuce boycott, revolutionary El Salvador, whoa. And so it took me for a ride that I'm still on, like that, I love revolutionary politics like I love few things outside of people.
So what then happened with the FMLN?
Okay, now
So
you're
we're
asking.
talking. Because we're talking revolutionary spirit, which I really, I feel you. You know what I'm saying? There have been a few moments in my little life that I have felt in a movement that have been the most fundamentally important moments of my life, right? And so I'm feeling you, okay? So then we're putting, it's like, and I remember the Sandinistas and what happened with the Sandinistas. So what's your take on that?
Well, it's complicated.
Well, of course
CHERRÍE.
it's complicated. No, I know it is. But, from us that are from afar, we're going, well, it's like you're kind of going, how could this happen?
On the one hand, I don't like to fall into these tired tropes that elites in the capitalist system will throw on revolution, because the job of any elites, the job of national security operatives and the media structures, the cultural structures, and the other structures that are overrun with national security culture at this stage in U.S. history, their job is to kill whatever hope that you have.
Well, we saw that with the Panther movement and all of that, right?
Yeah, if they have to kill you, they'll do it. Yes. They are that savage.
But there is something about what happens when the revolution becomes a state, right?
Yeah, and so that's the other part of it, is that the story I tell here, I got into the FMLN part because that was part of my story that I'd never been out about. I had to hide this. Talking about secrets, and I had to hide this for like 30 years almost. Yeah. And because they weren't going to give me a job, or they weren't going to give me a Pulitzer grant. I've been a freelancer at New American Media. I was working at Tecolote in San Francisco, community paper, and I was an urban commander with an FMLN guerrilla. Maybe not, Roberto, sorry, but so I had to kind of be chill about that. And then, so part of what I wanted to do here, in addition to just coming out about something that I don't want to be that I don't want to be hidden anymore, especially at this moment in history, right? I think the revolutionary sensibility is critical to your life right now. So,
you looked in the camera for that one.
Yeah.
Yes, good.
It's very important. And I'll look at you too. It's fundamental. So, like, the image of the FMLN and revolution in general, fed us by the state, its media institutions, etc., is been degraded, right? As is their job to do, right? I mean, that's why you send people from the intelligence apparatus of the United States, CIA, national security, into like CNN, the Washington Post, and other places, I mean, we saw this during El Salvador, where people like Ray Bonner, a stellar investigative reporter, when he started getting too deep into the mass graves and the killings in El Salvador, he was snatched out, put in Philippines, and replaced by another journalist who was basically towing the party line of the state. So given that, and given the way that the FMLN image was tarnished by the elites, but also by the FMLN itself. When the FMLN got into power, some of the leadership got, not all, because there's still people who are illuminated and revolutionary to this day at the base and in some of the leadership. I know them. But the people that were really running the show were not among them anymore. They took a turn away from the revolutionary ideals, and some got corrupted by money and power, the old story. And so El Salvador is at a crossroads right now where it's, not got this one of the greatest revolutionary organizations, according to the CIA, was the FMLN in the 20th century, Latin America. So, my mission with the book was to recognize the tarnished part, but rescue the sacred tradition of revolutionary culture, ideology, and action that we're going to need to face, the crisis in the world that capitalism has brought upon us all in unprecedented ways, starting with climate change and ending with climate change. So, the FMLN, I mean, I have some of my closest friends in life are ex-guerrilleras and guerrilleros. One of the loves of my life was a guerrillera.
Yes.
And that's how I tell the story, which is like...
I was going to say, that's the movie part. No, I'm telling you, like that in the telling of this story, when you get to the love interest, right? This is going to make a good movie. I'm just talking Hollywood, right? Because there is also this, you see this young man he's getting so consciente, he's so, you just like this fire of consciousness happening, right? And then there's this young woman he falls in love with, right? But it takes a long time getting there in the thing, and it's quite beautiful. I mean, I felt that. I mean, talking about the tenderness, right? And also that what I kind of appreciate about that storyline too is that when it didn't work out, you don't go into it. And I kind of like that. I like that you almost then get the impression like, oh yeah, that was one of those love affairs that you fall in love with the revolution, with each other, and you go on. You go on with your work, And I thought that was really lovely. I like that.
Thank you. Some people wanted to hear what happened and
I know.
everything.
Well,
I appreciate you saying that. You're rescuing me from the critics out there. But no, actually, G and I are still friends. She didn't want me to use her real name because she has her reasons. Many Salvadorans, I mean, 1 of every 3 Salvadorans was organized against the state during the war, which means a high percentage of the Salvadorans walking around in Washington, New York, the Mission in San Francisco, L.A., you name it, wherever there's Salvadorans, you're going to find revolutionaries right there. You just got to scratch the surface. Like I did an event with a university that will remain nameless in the Bay Area. And one of the students was there in the Zoom call, and suddenly her parents were there, and they held up this flag that said, BPR, Bloque Popular Revolucionario. The parents were like beaming with pride that there was a public event talking about their revolutionary experience as a couple, as a young couple, which is like, this is why you don't have Salvadorans telling the story of Salvadorans and Central Americans. You don't have Central Americans telling our own story. I believe that if we were allowed to speak to the issues of child separation, caging, killing Central American children, we would show what we know, but we would also show what we've been through and how we fought. Right. And, I mean, really, this is
And what people are capable of.
And what people are capable of.
That is that's the threat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to bring Celia in. She's going to, she's going to do our cameo. I promised that I wouldn't bring her in, but then we broke our promise. And Celia, will you join us?
Please.
I wanted to bring her in right now because, too, that you have some similar histories, too, of organizing as a young woman and as a, in terms of working with CASA, et cetera. And
You were with Casa?
back in the day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And also about having certain sort of affinities politically that, are not supposed to be mentioned, and what all of that is about. But so I wanted to bring you in, you don't have to talk about it right this second, but we're in this role, right? But the other part I want to make sure that we talk about is also where you're really, what's happening now with the migration, right? With all the migrations going on, and then and particularly the whole Northern Triangle. Then this period, and you're talking about revolution, right? And what's happening is in a certain level because it's like, I want to say, it's almost like the worst that could be happening, right? Environmentally, all the reasons that are pushing people into migration, right? It is an environmental question. It is a question of, issues of carteles. It is a question of government, corruption. It is, all of that, right? So that's all the fodder, of revolution, right? But on, on our most mundane lives, it seems as far away as it could be. When you're talking about, and you mentioned early in our email exchanges, the crisis. That's the word that you keep using. That is, and then you use the plural of it, crises, right? That there's all these elements coming in. So I know, CELIA and I have long conversations about this condition that we're all in. So so how does one, and ultimately the book has hope, right? Hope coming out of trauma, right? How does one do that?
Well, I try to do it in the book I mentioned earlier the intersecting Christ underworlds. The intersecting underworlds are, at least in the design of the book, was trying to get at the issue of the intersecting crises that we face in our families, among our youth, in the cities. Climate change is mentioned briefly, and crisis in the political system, the economy. And so, we have to, I have a lot of hope because of scholars that have studied, like biblical scholars. I've interviewed, as I mentioned in the book, scholars of the what's known as the apocalyptic literature in the Jewish tradition that was then adopted by the Christian tradition. This one scholar, Anathea Poitier-Young, author of a book called Apocalypse Against Empire. I was fascinated. I was used to be a right-wing evangelical fascist, if you want to know the truth.
There's a chapter on that.
Yeah, there's a chapter on that. I learned to be a militant, and I'm sorry for it, and I forgive my sins for being a right-wing evangelical fascist. But so Anathea Poitier-Young, I called her. I said, that's the kind of thing my mom does. Like, I don't care who you are, I'll call you up. So I called her Anathea Poitier.
That makes you a good journalist.
So I called her up, and she was really generous and willing to talk about her book. And she's talking about the way that, under the conditions under which this apocalyptic literature were written, and she said it was written under what we would today call state terror, which is a term we don't even use anymore. You notice terrorism has been designated to individuals. We've taken away from states. So she's telling me about the conditions under which it was written, and then in order to understand the psychology and the spirit under which the apocalyptic literature was written, she studied two countries. One was Argentina during the Dirty War, which was a lot of terror, and the other one was this little country called El Salvador.
Wow.
My head blows up. I'm like, damn, I know more about apocalypse than I thought. And I felt sad at a certain level because there's no, there's no goodness in the degrees of violence that my people have faced. But there is goodness in the overcoming and to excavate the part of us that survives that. Right? That's kind of our mission right now. We have to kind of be like these other figures that I've kind of geeked out on when I was into the Bible a lot, is the desert fathers and the desert mothers. When the empire started getting corrupt, when Constantine united the Western and Eastern empires of the church and the empire, these spiritual peoples in the desert of Syria, Egypt, saw the coming corruption, and they decided to take what they felt was the most sacred parts of the word and go into the desert, into these caves, to preserve it. Which is kind of like what I feel our roles as writers, especially older writers right now. We carry you, despite your youth, and you, Celia, I've seen your art,
Despite
by the
everything.
way, and so I now know you to be a bearer of these sacred knowledge as well. Our job is kind of like that Jedi thing. We have to drop the valuable knowledge of revolution, of survival, of love, of the radicality of love, and you know, share it with the young people so that they can get beyond this kind of ridiculous kind of language that just keeps them inactive and inoperative against the titanic forces that they're facing.
Part of the reason I wanted to bring Celia, and this is Celia Herrera Rodriguez for people that weren't here at the top, co-director of Las Maestras Center, and she's also, she teaches in Chicano studies, Chicano studies here at UC Santa Barbara. So not only your political, you know, history, Celia, coming up, you know, but also what he's talking about in terms of also the, you know, spiritually, right? And also the questions that we've talked about so much about, you know, these borders of nation states, et cetera. And I also know you had some notes for Roberto. So how would you like to kind of jump into this conversation?
Well, I wanted to jump in on the bones, you know. I wanted to jump in on the bones, Roberto. I feel that there's a generational discussion that's happening as you name, you know, all of the points that you make, you know, between looking at, looking at history and looking at the places where the knowledge has been saved, even coming right now in, as you speak of the desert. And I think that there is a generational, as you say, prophecy, you know, that we've come into, that this is where we've come into the world. This is our entry into the world, this generation that can hold all those thoughts. So when you say the bones, you know, I start to think about the underworld journeys that have been written about in the desert. I think there's a couple stories about, I think it's Descent of the Goddess, in which, you know, it's spoken about one of the goddesses, one of the queens actually, who is stolen off into the underworld. And she has to, or actually she chooses to go there. She chooses to go there. It is one of those journeys of becoming. And she goes there to meet another goddess on the underworld. She doesn't realize how long she's going to be gone, but she asks her sister, her best friend, her other sister, her other woman, if she doesn't come back, to please come get her, to let her family know so they'll come get her. And what happens is that she is trapped. She's entrapped in the underworld. She's hung up on a meat cleaver, left there for a long time. She rots, basically. And the sister above goes to find some helps for her. Goes to her husband, who's now the consort, who's totally happy, doesn't even miss the queen, because now the consort is in charge. Goes to the father, who's very busy with the state. And eventually, you know, it takes a long time for her to get the folks to come and to the underworld to save this woman. And they do. They bring her back. And when she comes back with the knowledge that she can't face the consort anymore. The consort cannot live up to what she's experienced, you know, what has happened to her in the underworld, that consciousness, you know, of the body. That's how I read it, the consciousness of the body, you know, of embodying what it is you do, as you were saying, you know, when you go down to the bone. And it's the bone that is in and as you were speaking, I started to think about, you know, those stories that the Maya tell us, you know, your homeland, those home stories that are so much a part of our bones or in our DNA, and how it is that prophecy lives in that DNA. And it gets loose in the blood. You know, it gets loose in the blood. It gets loose in the burning of the blood that releases the spirit. Those are the things we're told. And so as you're speaking, I start to think about those things, about where things are saved, you know, where they're held in our bodies and where they're held on earth. And so, yes, right now we're being moved, and everything I dream and everything I know, and when I hear you speak, I say it is about the prophecy. It is about what all our peoples bring here. all the peoples that have joined here at this moment historically. So when you speak the politic, I say, it is the politic that I miss. There's lots of language, but it can't all take us home. Some of the language is interesting, and yes, it names things that in ways that we need to hear, but it doesn't necessarily release us. It doesn't necessarily bring us back into our bodies. It doesn't necessarily connect us. So that's what I was appreciating when you were in that last section of the epilogue, when you were talking about the release of the blood, the release of the pain, the release of the suffering, and how it is that you come back from it. That journey of returning is what gives it the possibility that you can speak from it, that you can transcend it, that you can speak from it. And I was really excited to see that it is what I want to say is Chicana, Chicanx, Chicano, however we want to say it, the X, the Chi, that it is the part of our continental understanding. If we can let go of the nation state, if we can let go of all of that, then we can see ourselves as peoples. We can see our relationships.
All right, so you're going to have to get the workers here that y'all have hired to put on a couple more hours. Celia just dropped some knowledge I want to connect with.
Our media team here.
Media team, sorry, media team, we're going to be here a few more hours. So, no, thank you for joining us. This is why I asked, if you could be in here when.
Yeah. We wanted her, but you had to be the one to ask, because she was, no, don't invite me this time.
No, that I could
I'm
tell.
taking notes.
Before I came, I want to say, well, who's this Celia? Because I never met Celia. Who's this Celia person? And I checked out your art, and it immediately resonated with me. The colors, the themes, the connection to the land and peoples, and the just the sheer beauty of it. Really beautiful stuff.
Thank you.
I commend you.
Thank you.
And as you're talking, I can tell you this person's a kindred spirit in the underworld journeys.
Yeah.
In different ways. I'm sure. Maybe even I won't out you about it, but I will guess, I will beckon that there's been some kind of ceremonies where there's been kind of certain substances, sacred, ancient substances shared to bring enlightenment. I say this in jest, but I mean this in reality.
But it is true.
It really is true that, that going into the underworld in different ways, through different means, has been there for peoples and civilizations and cultures from the beginning, and it's still there. And I've tried to make a study of it when I was writing this, because I realized, damn, my dad was in all these criminal networks. My dad used to run guns and contraband from the Mission and
from the bakery.
from Hunt's Donuts
Hunt's Donuts, yeah.
to El Salvador. And this is on the back of the network that my abuelita built. Because I didn't know that I always thought my dad was the innovator. The patriarch in me just automatically ascribes to my dad the agency of creating the criminal network that sustained our family in part. When in fact my abuelita was the one who built the initial contraband empire on the ships that would go from Acajutla port to San Francisco, and so there's that underworld journey, and I just started reading and saying wow, this is really an underworld journey. It was obvious to me when I delved deeper, and I was like, whoa, man, I need to kind of get some help. So before I started writing, I retained a therapist. Yeah. I retained a therapist so that I could map the terrain emotionally that I was going to have to traverse in writing. Because I know you wanted to ask me about the structure and what you're saying about the need for that journey. One of the things I learned in not just the writing of the book, but in studying underworld and how they work in cultures and in oral traditions and in writing, oftentimes they come up at the origin of a people's. There's an underworld journey.
Sure. Yeah.
In the Mayan tradition, in the Aztec tradition, in the Mesopotamian tradition, there's underworld journeys, and in the but there's also a part of that journey that requires us to kind of go at a time of crisis, not just in origin, but in crisis. Yeah. So, and I really, underworld consciousness, underworld tropes, whatever you want to call it, are really powerful at a time of crisis, because at a time of crisis, power comes down, and it just creates all these waves of lies, or what the Hindus call Maya, right? It's just the veil of illusion is so vast with the internet now, especially.
God.
So that the underworld journey is a gift that allows us to go underneath all the bullshit
Right.
to get to the deeper, like, what's that phrase that Milton had, like, in the lowest underworld, what is it? It's like, I forget, like the lower, in descending into the lowest, there's even a lower place. You can always go deeper.
Yeah.
And that's a gift, but we have to have the courage and the need to do it. It takes courage to go into the underworld, to go into the dark that is there anyway if you're talking about trauma.
Yeah.
Because trauma is that which we cannot see, we cannot touch, but it is there doing its work. And the work of governments is to mass produce trauma.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
And so I wanted to exemplify and illustrate what one young Salvadoran kid born in San Francisco's journey to overcome the inherited trauma. And I don't often talk about trauma because I think, in using the word, I hardly use it in the book. And I think the term has been cheapened
Oh, yes.
by many people. And so, but I'll use it here. I'm in good company. And so the trauma I inherited from my father and my mom growing up under a military dictatorship, the trauma of the domestic expression through violence and humiliations I experienced, mostly with my father, the trauma of the war that I've witnessed, the trauma of now the gang violence and the government violence that are one and the same, right? They're part of the two-sided Janus-faced thing that's haunting us, right? And, being able to face all that, one piece at a time. I didn't face it all at once. Being able to face all that was a way for me to give my best, because it takes our best to be able to go in there, right? And I'm doing it to give my best, because I could see in 2015 when I started writing the journey of writing the book that the world was taking a direction that it's currently has. The neo-fascism, the climate change, the ruthless capitalism and becoming more ruthless worldwide and within the United States, the emptying out of the welfare state in the United States.
Yes.
All of this was clear to me in 2015, and I thought, man, I better drop what I'm here to drop now before I get older and forget. So that's why it's unforgetting. Unforgetting, and it refers to this Greek concept of aletheia, which, I don't like to be Eurocentric, but it's a beautiful concept for me. It was just describing that underworld journey that the dead would have to take before going to Hades or Elysium. They had to cross the river Lethe, which was the river of forgetting. And so they had to forget who they were. And so the Greeks associated forgetting with untruth and remembering or unforgetting with truth, because the word aletheia means unforgetting literally, and they equated it with truth. And so in the present moment of neo-fascism that we're in, I'm here thinking about this, and former, kind of theology student and former kind of rhetoric and philosophy student at Berkeley, I'm getting into like, oh wow, man, Hannah Arendt, theorist of fascism extraordinaire, is looking at the role of forgetting in helping create fascism. And she excavates this Greek idea that she got from some of the work that Martin Heidegger created, which was aletheia, unforgetting. But the way she used it was unique as far as she felt that it was important to unforget. If you're going to fight fascism, you have to fight at the level not just of the present, but you have to fight in the fights in the past. You have to unforget the things that brought you to where we are now, that brought us to where we are now. And I think that's the struggle. I think any writer knows that. Any writer with their bones, right?
With their bones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of the bones.
The work is that. I mean, when I was talking to you about the form of it, right? The structure, you're weaving. I mean, the day, you even have, like that whole list of the dramatis personae, it's like, so it's a there, and that reminds me also back to the theater element, right? The dramatic element. But it is, I mean, I feel like it is to quote my own self, it's a right to remember, RITE, that the writing itself becomes your own ceremony. It becomes you're when you're referring to ingesting what one needs to in order to go to the underworld, right? What kinds of medicines does one need to do that? However one defines that. It feels that way. It feels that there is this jornada that because it's not linear at all, in that sense. So it's like there's a major reveal at the end, but we're already there. We're already moving into it. And so you're getting well. You get well in it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so hopeful, because you see this, it is an autobiographical text, right? And so we see this person he's well. He's well.
People that know me for a long time, back in the day, they were like, some people used to tell me, man, you were so intense. Because I was an angry dude, very angry dude, violent. You read the book, I was in a little clique of guys, we called ourselves Los Originales in the mission. We were engaged in violence and fighting, robbing people, stealing cars, dating women in stolen cars. And we were involved in what working class kids are often, exposed to. And so I know what it is to be labeled a criminal. I know what it is to be treated like a criminal. And I wanted to kind of show what the roots of that and connect it to the quote unquote criminals that are the gangs. Mm-hmm. And so the structure of the book came to me when I realized, like, how the hell am I going to tell this? Because I got this stuff with my dad's history, I got the stuff in the present, and I got my own upbringing. So then this friend of mine, and he was a teacher, Brad Kessler, showed me this thing called a fish diagram, where you kind of have this one spine of the fish up here, and this other spine of the fish down below, and then they connect at the beginning and at the end.
Oh, okay.
And so then I saw that, and then I was like, oh wow, then I can also create 8 different sections, and each one of them being divided by 3, each going and connecting, and starting to make the connections in the writing between the violence of the gangs, the violence that I witnessed as a kid in the house, and then the violence of Salvadoran history, because my dad's violence was informed by the violence, right. And so the violence in the war is related to the military dictatorship, and so I did it for that, but I also did it because I wanted to reproduce, and here's that word again. It's a good word, but it's been abused. Trauma. I wanted the reader to experience.
Well, you succeed in that.
What is it like? What is it like to be? Because one of the qualities of trauma is fragmentation, and we all have it.
Right.
The fact that we're talking about nation states. Nation states are in the business of fragmenting initially indigenous life, and then fragmenting workers who become these citizens. Like in my dad's hometown, after La Matanza, you look at the birth records before my dad was born, most of the children in his town of Ahuachapan were Indios. That was the state's label, not mine. It's a racist term in El Salvador. If you look at the birth certificates after the Matanza in my dad's hometown, they created this new concept, campesino. Okay. So and then they create these evolutionary Darwinist theories of, hey, here's the Indio migrating and evolving into the campesino.
It's just so sick.
So I wanted to show the way that modernity and the violence of modernity fragment our lives to this day. Like our families as Salvadorans are so fragmented in Australia. And even now, our lives, whoever we are, there's mobility all the time because of capitalism's uprooting our lives. So I felt like, man, I could share this kind of experience and this kind of study of fragmentation of nations and the fragmentation that brought on by trauma on an intimate level. And I thought the structure, chopping up the structure with the machete would do that. And so then I have two metaphors, because I don't want to leave readers just chopped up and, damn, life sucks. No, I'm not that kind of a writer. I'm not, like a lot of white writers write about us, right? It's just tragic and
Right, exactly.
screwed up.
Right.
But I wanted to share what I learned about how to do what my abuelita did, which was stitch things back together. So in opposition to the machete effect of borders and of history, I have the two metaphors. One speaks to your bones. You're interested in the bones and the bones below, was the work of forensics, forensic scientists. Because I'm not one of these leftists that's opposed to science. I think we need to have just a left control of science, But I'm not going to get rid of science. But so forensic science, forensic medicine, putting together literally the bones of the thousands, tens of thousands of people buried in the landscape of El Salvador, because most of the bones of the war are unexcavated, uninvestigated. Mass killings are not investigated, thanks to the U.S. and presidents like Bukele. And so, the act of actually, I was with these forensics scientists going to these mass grave sites in these really scary places that were controlled by gangs, where they would bury their victims, right? And the gangs would bury their victims in some places above the places where the death squads buried the dead killed by the death squads. And so the act of bringing together the story, because remember, if you're somebody, and I know people who live with the horror of desaparecido culture, disappeared, where if you have a family member who's lost, your child, your mother, your father, your relative, you don't know what happened to them. You're like a hungry ghost. You're there perpetually unresolved, and so the act of literally excavating the bones of these mass graves, stitching them together, putting them together to finish the story of this person for another chapter, and then you hand the bones to the family, and that family gets at least some modicum of closure, and they start another journey with their deceased. It was just a beautiful, the science and the story. And forensics, by the way, has a lot to do with like literature, like Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. They imagined the first forensics labs in Murders in the Rue Morgue, and one of Conan Doyle's stories. And then the actual people that created the first forensics labs in France, in Lyon, were reading Poe, and so you have literature influencing science. So the other metaphor, and I'll cut it short on this, but is sewing. My abuelita, my mamate, who was a seamstress in this Depression era El Salvador that made John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath look like a pizza festival or a wine festival, right? My abuelita sewing her way out of this shanty town, Salvadoran favela, we call them mesones, to take her kids, my father and his siblings, out of the extreme poverty where they lived among mostly prostitutes and sex workers in urban San Salvador. And so my abuelita then extended the weave all the way to the United States and she was the matriarch of all of us and brought everybody here. And she would even bring migrants, like my dad was telling me, he thinks maybe like 40, 50 people migrated under my abuelita's auspices outside of our family. And so the way she weaved together, her family kept it together and tied together these two countries in business and in the heart, right? It was like just the work that we have to do to face modernity for me. I'm sorry to be so long about it, but that was I was thinking, with the machete cutting us up, forensics and sewing being the way we bring it back together, is metaphorically, because that's the work we have to do to literally keep our shit together.
Well, I think that's the part that I saw also, that keeps resonating over and over again. If we think of the great mother, if we think of the mother, and I think you said that when you were speaking earlier. You also, talking about your mom's home, your mother's home, and talking about all the family being present, and also that your father was not. It was a very small amount because of the silence, and it made me, remember then that yes, I have been in ceremony for many, many, many years, and the prayer that I've had throughout that entire time was the healing, or the healing of the fragmentation of my own family. So, the fragmentation that, that my own family suffered just in my generation, the generation before me, it made me question, was it, as a kid, was it, where were all the silences, and what was missing? Those were so many ways that were never spoken to. What was missing? In our case, what was missing was the majority of the men in our life. They were missing. There was no answer to where they were. There was no story to what happened, and then the fragmentation, that caused in our own experience. In fact, going to one of the Luisa Tish, one of the Maestras of the Yoruba tradition in the Bay Area, gave us a prayer, a task, and an ofrenda to make, to open the door, for the male relatives that she felt were at the door, we needed to open that door to be able to understand what had happened, because the story was closed. And in that same way, I feel like that when you speak of tenderness, when you speak of having to come back into, in the return, because basically it makes me think of, the stories they tell about if you want to be, and I think even Carlos Castañeda told a story, which I think influenced us very deeply, which was if you go off, to become a person of knowledge, you go off to seek something beyond yourself, something more deeper and more understanding, to be able to have that intuition connect to your intellect, then you have to then go to the underworld, which is a fragmenting experience. That's what happens to Inanna. She rots on a hook. She completely disintegrates. The return and coming back and reforming yourself to be able to bring and rescue yourself. It also means to be able to bring yourself to life. And again, that idea then of the young shoot, the tenderness, the coming back to life again, the breath of life that you sense in the newly born, that just tender just little breath, that holds on to life so firmly. That, I think, is the mother's home, right? That's the return. And I think that is the part that we're all experiencing. As you speak, I can't help but think about my own children, my own family, what's happening in the streets of my hometown, Sacramento. Everything you say, I feel like I see it, like I always say, at my kitchen table. Amongst my own children, amongst my grandchildren, I see the effects of this history that you speak of. It isn't far away. It isn't
just Salvadoran.
No, it's not. It's not at all.
We have our particular form as Salvadoreños, but the story of fragmentation, modernity, and violence is not. We don't have a monopoly on it.
Well, when I started to investigate the violence in my family and ask why the fragmentation, it took me all the way back to the 16th century. Just telling the story of my own family, it took me all the way back to the 16th century within the area of northern Mexico. And you see that, and that story is so eliminated, it's so obscured, that we don't even understand. We can't even get to what happened here, what put us here, what brought us to this moment. That is, I think, what was important about the book, about those connections that you make, and giving us again, it's like not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to allow us to see all the writers and all the thinkers and all the places in which we as human beings have lived, instead of seeing them as the other someplace else. I mean, when you speak about bringing back to our humanity, it also is what we as human beings have experienced and have brought into this world, what we've made visible, what our task is to keep remaking visible. As we sit in this particular time, as we say, in terms of this sort of sixth consciousness or sixth creation, or however people are talking about it, that we sense that it isn't, that nothing that was before, except, everything trying to hold it down. As we experience this state, this nation state, and all its lies and all its ways that it tries to, I don't think that that's possible anymore. I mean, my prayer is that, of course, that our young people, can find themselves, that they can, and I have great hope in them, and that we can keep connection between us and not see ourselves as, the past, and the past has nothing to do with the present, or to see all our elders as somehow having to be perfect before we can talk to them, that there's nothing to learn at home. All those places that are fragmented in our experience. As I sit here and I can, as you're speaking, and I think there's so many places within ourselves and our consciousness, even the last 40 years of history, that have been fragmented, so that we find ourselves, having to remember ourselves.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying. It makes me think about, like, we're on Earth Day today.
Yeah.
Every day is Earth Day, but let's just celebrate it just like Hispanic Heritage Month or something. Find what's good in it and move on. But, Pachamama,
Yeah.
Mother Earth.
Right.
And one of the transformative experiences for me, 2011, 12, was going to Bolivia for a gathering of thousands from around the world under the auspices of the Bolivian government headed by Evo Morales. And I interviewed Evo, and I interviewed his main cadre of thinkers, visionary, brilliant,
Yeah.
indigenous, non-indigenous
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
They're the ones that came up with this ideas like the plurinational state of Bolivia.
See.
Taking the nation state structure and
I love it.
flipping
I
the
know,
tortilla
I know,
over,
I know.
coming up with the universal rights, or reminding us about the
Yes.
universal rights of Mother Earth.
Yes.
And so when Evo opens up this gathering, this giant stadium with tens of thousands, mostly indigenous people, and he says, Planeta o muerte, planet or death, which is a riff on the old slogan we used to say during the revolution in El Salvador and across the Americas, Revolución o muerte. You said that and you were like tuning up your machine to go to war and fight
Yeah.
like your life depended on it and those of others did. So Evo was basically greening the revolution and reddening the greening, which was like, and rooting it in indigenous First Peoples
Absolutely.
consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah.
But doing it with the power of the state behind them, which, Evo had his contradictions
Yeah.
with lithium and some other things, but the fact that it was the first indigenous president of the Americas in 500 years of like,
know,
whoa.
it's
And so the consciousness that's even now emanating out of Bolivia and other parts of the Americas gives me my great hope as well, along with our young people who, I encourage people to follow what do they call it, the red road and different other consciousness, but to do it in a way where it drives people to action in the streets, in the world, because we won't get through this without that.
But also what's key, to me what's really key is that what you're saying about trauma, right, is that also there's so many obstacles, and obstacles, especially like through social media, all this kind of stuff, it is a perversion of language that's indicative of something much more profound. The whole thing, like I remember that point as an educator of people telling you, make sure you give trigger warnings, and I'm going, well, wait a minute, I'm teaching writing, I'm teaching creative writing. I want them to get down and dirty, I want them to go to the underworld. Trust me. As I say, I can hold it. I swear to Jesus, I can hold it. Go there with me. Just go there with me. I don't waste time when I teach. It's like if I have to do it, and you want to be a writer, you're going to do it too. And I mean that in such a respectful, loving way, And yet there's so many obstacles now to teaching, because what you're talking about trauma, the reason why you can walk in this world a better person is because you wrote that book, and you went underground, You know, you went to the underworld, and I'm not trying to be. What's hard about language is that then people take you very literally, right? And what I'm talking about is that we have to unforget, and the only way to be well is to unforget, which is to remember. Start putting the pieces back together. Yes. And so, and you know, this is like we talked as Chicana feministas for years. We talked about that figure of Coyolxauhqui, who's the dismembered female, you know, and putting her back together. Then this is the warrior woman, right? These are like, I mean, the mythologies are there from the beginning of time. But I think that what you're saying about, particularly about the condition of the planet, right? Particularly us as people of color in this world, it's like how do we move with that, right? And because it also has felt in the United States that has always been, you know, that we don't get that, you know, that this is it's always been associated from the earliest times around any kind of, you know, the Sierra movement and all this kind of stuff. So what is our place in those movements?
Beats me, man. I don't know. That's a Nobel Prize question.
I know. I mean, but this is, yeah, and yet it is absolutely front burner.
It's
absolutely, we don't have any other, there's no other.
No, but before I answer that, I want to ask you, have there been attempts to cancel you here at Santa Barbara, CHERRÍE?
Always. There's
my
always
God.
attempts to cancel me. No, I mean that. No, I don't mean that. Just me. I'm saying there is a culture of, you know, you know, it's not particular to this necessarily, but yes, you know, but this has been going on from it keeps whatever we do, you know, you are speaking in a dangerous way. You know, and we're here, we're good, you know, it's good, right? You're taking risk in your language, you know, because you're not lying. You're trying to tell a much deeper truth. And we hope it's, you know, it's like you're doing it because you can't waste your time anymore. You know, you can't pretend anymore. You're too old. You got your work to do. You're going to do your work. I think when we're talking about to be elders as you grow in age, right? For those of us that have those commitments, you don't waste your time anymore. And also because you're suddenly going to leave a planet, you know, and you're leaving all these people behind you. And all you can do is say, I can't bullshit you anymore. I'm not going to bullshit you. You need to know what I know before I go, and there is and that's very dangerous, but not dangerous like it's going to kill you. I mean, it can ruin your reputation. It can do all kinds of stuff. You know, it's like, but I don't know how to explain this, but the whole so-called language of cancel culture and all of that has actually repressed really important truths from being told. It has censored really important speakers
within our community.
Within our communities.
Right. And
sometimes the people that are the most like us, right, is how that's happening. And this has been a current change. I mean, it has been, you know, like last 5 years. That seems pretty current to me, you know.
As a journalist, if I may put on my journalist hat for a moment, investigative journalist in Boston Globe Foreign Policy, I have the pedigree, I think, for that now at this stage of my game.
I think so.
I've been a student of U.S. national security. I've also been a student of national security because I was fighting U.S. national security, surveillance, etc. And so, you know, for me, the art of it is to try to think like a state. Like, I forget that anthropologist who wrote that book about that. But you try to think like the state, and the state has a way of thinking and acting that we need to understand. And we need to understand that at every moment in history where it seems like people from below, los de abajo, as Mariana Azuela wrote, you know, speaking of the underworld, right? And you know, at a moment when black and brown and API people were going to join forces with some white people and really take it to the system, like in the 60s. Inevitably, there's this meme and these memes, this divisive discourse that is spread that if you read like this book called Du Bois' Telegram by a Harvard scholar, I forget her name right now, but Du Bois' Telegram, you'll see that the state security apparatus was looking at culture and ways to divide people, the ways to divide W.E.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson, Ella Baker, and other, titanic figures of the black radical experience from the rest of the black community because they had left communist sympathies. So if you've, as we say in buen salvadoreño, si le has tocado los huevos al tigre, if you've touched the tiger's balls, as has been the case for those of us that tried to overthrow the state, you're going to learn a lot about power and how power and empire work. And so I have, as an investigative journalist, looked at, for example, I got documents that showed me that even the Dreamer movement had been infiltrated by the CIA.
Yeah, I believe that.
Okay? Elements of it. When you start seeing suddenly these kind of like left-wing dreamers being attacked, and then you have these like pretty much right-wing Democrat dreamers. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to, but I have documents that show there was minimally conversations between people in and around the CIA and the Dreamer movement. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're now at a point where things like, this idea of pessimism is becoming fashionable. Well, fuck, I've been in a war. Dude, pessimism has no place in the middle of a war. And we're in the middle of a war
Thank you.
of unprecedented scale, but it's a war that's more silent, slower, but no less lethal at the level of killing, impoverishing, exploiting on a massive scale. So that, it's no coincidence that people are talking and acting in ways with this cancel culture stuff, in ways that disarm and disable power movements from below. And we have to, by any means necessary, build the power from below to take on the fight, to be on an even, on a more even scale than these colossal powers that are amassed against us. But I mean, it's possible, and we have to. And and the inner part that you talk about, for me, that's why I never imagined writing a memoir. Like, write a memoir, navel gazing, but. Then I realized I couldn't tell the story any other way.
Yeah, there you go.
And that, because I follow Audre Lorde in saying, I don't know what her exact quote, but I remember I read that and I turned it from my own language into, hey, I tell young people, hey, you want to be dangerous? You got to be dangerous right now. If you want to be dangerous in a diseased society like the one we're in,
That's what you have to be.
the most radical thing you could do in that way is be healthy. Be healthy with a political focus, not just be like a vegan and, disconnected from, I don't laugh at vegan, I like veganism, but don't be disconnected from the movements of your time.
Exactly.
But if you can be a vegan or whatever health means to you in your mind and your body, you're going to be able to institute and be a part of what I think is one of the other great necessities of a time of enormous planetary, crises. Is just, we have to make ourselves more sustainable on the planet. So to do that, we have to have sustainable struggle. Sustainable struggle, as you were one of the pioneers of in our communities, and Audre Lorde, is as much personal as it is political. Sure. Right? So we have to be healthy and then take on the social struggle parallel to that. Don't wait to fight. Start fighting and get healthy in the middle of the fight.
Well, I think that's some of the things that have been so confounding and confusing, just looking at what it means to be healthy. I mean, what propelled me to, to seek out healers, to seek out the medicine people, to look at remembering as medicine, or unforgetting, as you call it, as medicine, to accept the pain of it because it is painful, and to accept the time, that we are so influenced by Western thinking and Western medicine that we think you take the pill, then you feel better, and then you're well. But it's not true. First of all, you have to figure out what happened. That's the unforgetting part, the what happened. And you have to sit still long enough where you have to be able to be in your body while you experience that. And I think that's gotten a little bit lost, as people now become seekers of enlightenment, seekers of knowledge, whatever it is. It isn't because there's this life, death, like, if I don't get well, I'm going to die, or my world's going to die, or my family's going to die, that kind of aspect of it, to really understand, that it isn't just about you, but it's about what surrounds you as well. That aspect of it,
And I just want to speak to something that you just said and that CHERRÍE said earlier about like writing as medicine. I'm not a proponent of that. I'm not a proponent of writing to heal. I think the story, CHERRÍE, and as an artist as well, story has its integrity. The story is the story. If I get healthy because of it, it's incidental to the fact of the story and the integrity of the story. But I'm not, because people making big bucks now on these seminars and, hey, write your pain and heal.
No, but I have to interrupt you. It's not, you're absolutely right?
Yeah.
You don't say, it is not therapy. Like you say, no, I don't write, the people say, oh, I felt, I feel so much better that's not, okay. You write because you're going to write. You're going to, whatever your intention is, and you write with your
Truth
intention.
and beauty, in my case.
Okay, but the fact of the matter is that if you're writing well, you're probably going to get better.
Oh, hell
I mean,
yeah.
that's what I'm saying. So
I mean,
they are absolutely integral.
Yeah.
So this is.
Well, I mean, I think that's also the same thing in terms of work. I mean, when you make work, you have to be in your body to make it, and you have to also then get out of your own way to make it. So it isn't like, everything you touch and everything in the process, is the art itself, but it is, an act that is medicinal. And maybe I'm also talking about what we're doing right now and trying to keep our political presence, our consciousness, as we seek, to understand ourselves as a people in wholeness, so that's mind, body, spirit. It isn't, that you can compartmentalize them. And though sometimes I feel like lately, everybody's it's almost precious, things become precious. You don't want to, you don't want to upset yourself. You don't want to, or your pain becomes so precious because it's the political tool that you're using. So things kind of have gotten in these kind of strange little places. And I think it is because, things are getting workshopped,
Yeah.
There's a commodification.
I do want to say I have a couple of chat questions here that I thought you might. We have just a couple here.
Okay.
Are you good?
I'm ready.
Okay. No, so this is from Justin Taylor, I think. You mentioned that literature is a good way to halt violent acts or the act of education, but some people do not have an interest in literature. What other methods can be introduced to help reduce violence?
Okay, well, to try to, the act of unforgetting is first of all an existential act, it's a personal, intimate act. It starts in your body and in your mind, the mind-body, the mind-heart, and in the family. So that precedes, I mean, it is literary too, because what do we draw our literature from? Is if we're going to be true, it's going to be coming from the real well of experience and emotion, right? So, where to go to address the issues of violence. I think in addition to unforgetting, there's another word I really like, which is unlearning. People, like I have a mentor and who taught me that the need to unlearn, that we're educated into submission. And you have theorists like, Louis Althusser and Gramsci, Stuart Hall, who, look, you're being educated to be docile, submissive, exploitative, good workers.
Yeah, of course.
So,
as an agenda.
And people like old school, R.D. Laing, anybody remember R.D. Laing? Alice Miller teaches that oftentimes the first entry point of the state in our lives are our parents. Damn! You mean my mom and my dad were aligned with the fascist military dictatorship? They're not exactly aligned, but they lived under it, and some of their education and some of their the violence that they experience is coming through them onto me. I think a lot of you might look at that with your parents. Like with the case of a lot of Salvadorans, you have a lot of Salvadorans, even Mexicans now are going right-wing evangelical.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, when was, that
But
wasn't
it's
the
all
case.
about colonialism, right?
It's
I mean,
totally
it's
about it.
just like so. Sometimes we've been, sometimes you just like sometimes I just look at, and I'm thinking about my own people, right? And you're teaching people, and then or like just in different community settings, and sometimes I just look and I go, oh my God, we're so colonized. You just go like that with pure compassion, So then your job is trying, one's job with each other is trying to unlock that. But that's what, it works. I mean, colonization works.
That's the beauty of poetry. What did Rimbaud, right?
Yeah.
The work of the poet is to disorganize the senses.
That's very good.
Because our senses are being organized by the state in all these different sophisticated ways. So if we're going to challenge that, or Brecht talking about, alienating us from reality, right? Reality's being shaped for us. We have to do things that
wake
just
'em up. Yeah.
wake folks up.
Yeah. So Maritza Alvarez has a question. How can we, this will be the last one here. How can we help all the child wisdom carriers that are locked up in state federal detention centers? How can we help their bodies return home from the underworld? Because that is right where they're experiencing.
Well, get with Ruthie Gilmore and the forces of abolition in the United States and around the world. I think policing and prisons go together, and they're part and parcel of capitalism. You have to, I hate to say it, you have to engage capitalism frontally. If you look at the numbers of people being imprisoned, it parallels when neoliberalism starts. Some people were saying around the late 60s and 70s. Reagan and Margaret Thatcher really accelerated it.
Right.
Where the state is abandoning entire regions and cities like Detroit, emptying them out of economic, kind of resources that were there before, globalizing them, communities left. And these includes white communities too, which is why you get Trumpism.
Right.
So when you have that level of abandonment by the state is when you start seeing the drug war, Nixon's drug war, and the increased imprisonment in the United States, but also around the world. Because they didn't just export policing from the U.S., they export imprisonment models. Like in El Salvador, probably the second most crowded prison state after the United States, or it ranks. And so you start seeing these American patterns. So I that's in the large frame. In the short term, go and start organizing to stop Biden right now is committed to the imprisonment of migrants with private prisons. He's
still doing it.
cutting off the budget to mainline prisons, but the immigrant prisons are remaining in private. I visited one in Texas a few weeks ago, and man, they treated me like I was a terrorist. They drove me out literally at the threat of arrest and violence against me. Like, whoa, I'm gonna write about this in an article. But so work to close prisons, defund them, educate yourselves, starting with our families. And this is where the whole Latinx thing has gotten really complicated now, since the days when you were writing loving the warriors, right? Back then it was a different Latinx community. Now the Latinx community is many of our families are divided between people that are in prisons and people that are prison guards and police. A lot of our and border patrol.
Yeah.
And so this is I don't have enough time, but a guy named Karl Rove, Bush's brain, helped think about this because he wrote about the way that in the McKinley era in the 19th century, they had the Irish problem, and they had to bring the Irish under the tent of whiteness. So that's where you start seeing the policing institution become this cultural institution that starts literally brainwashing and acculturating the marginalized Irish under the tent of whiteness. They want to do this with the Border Patrol, the police, with us.
Yeah.
And a lot of our people are now, I have families. I was driving on 101, and it's beautiful, it's green, but it's also got this rotten fruit of capitalism that are the prisons that align.
Yeah.
I had a cousin in Lompoc.
Yeah.
I'm just like, wow, man. I remember my cousin used to be in in this prison, and I'm thinking like, wow, there's all these prison guards. Even sadly, like when there was a fight several years ago, when between the prison guards and prisoners, and the prison guard union, and sadly enough, Dolores Huerta lined herself up with the prison guard union because of and I love Dolores. I know I'm in her PBS special, but we have to be critical of
Yes.
of our people when they're doing stuff like aligning themselves with prison guards. So it's really complicated now with prisons and prisoners and police, and you just we sticking with, like I said, people like Ruthie Gilmore and the magnificent work that she and others have done, to raise awareness and start acting on a conversation whose time has come. Mm-hmm. Let's abolish prisons.
Yep.
I love that. I mean, it was in the New York Times. Wow, it's real.
Yeah. So Roberto, what I want to do, because it's time now, so I'd like you to read that just the very end of the epilogue there that we talked about, and it'll bring in the sewing machine of your abuela as well. And
so the setting is that I'm at the end of the book, my journey in the book, and I'm trying to literally bring it all together. And I'm at a coffee shop in San Francisco.
one we know well.
One we know well.
La Boheme.
There's a storied history that has all these like beat poets and revolutionaries used to go and organize meetings there, like the Nicaraguans before the Salvadorans were organizing there, training in Bernal Heights with backpacks packed with rocks, and then they go to fight in the revolution. So like my own story has these Nicaraguans who preceded, like Roberto Vargas, Mission Cultural Center, Alejandro Murguia Chicano, who fought in the Nicaraguan Revolution, and others. And so they'd all meet at La Boheme along with beat poets and other crazy, cool-ass people. So I'm carrying the tradition there at the table. And so here it is. I'm sitting at my favorite table at Cafe La Boheme on 24th near Mission with my laptop in front of me, attempting to stitch together the disparate pieces of my origins as I write this book. The varnished oak tabletop sits on the base of an antique sewing machine. It's 12 by 10-inch iron treadle and iron gears it powers. The iron gears it powers still in place. Even though there's no longer a sewing machine above, the pedal moves the metal beast lying below most customers' awareness. Its black latticed elegance and noisy rotations remind me of bouncing on the lap of Mamate, the Salvadoran seamstress whose máquina de coser fueled her family's 3,000-mile journey to San Francisco. Pushing the pedal slowly, I start typing. The pin attached to the pedal of the sewing machinery below pushes and pulls the treadle wheel. To the annoyance of the techie sitting next to me, it squeaks every few revolutions. But still, the wheel turns. Up and down, up and down, up and down. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 motion of my foot working the treadle hypnotizes me. Next to the wheel, in the center of the space below the table, sits the machine's wrought iron logo. Slightly rusty silver and faded black laurels garnishing the Art Deco letters spelling the Singer Manufacturing Company. Coming here is a ritual for me. Something about coming to the neighborhood of my birth to write atop an old Singer sewing machine in a cafe named for the romantic opera La Boheme makes it easier to do the personal forensic work of recovering the fragments of my childhood and adolescent memories, especially the ones that are often more painful to conjure. I look out the window and up the street towards Horace Mann, my old junior high school, and I remember the shame, confusion, and molten anger I felt as a kid. I always had a sense somewhere deep within me that Pop, my father's secrets, his family history and upbringing, had something to do with his emotional absence and his violent temperament, even as it inspired his magic and charisma. Yet I'd lacked the history and therefore the context to understand him. Like many Salvadoran skeletons lying scattered and unstoried all over the southern part of the North American continent, Pop's memories might have assuaged my own nihilistic rage by helping me understand and address its source. We're lost for decades. Today, the plight of many of the Mara gang kids I've met fits the shit travels downward theory of violence that I developed when I started going to Berkeley. the theory I came up with thanks in no small part to pop. This downward momentum is created by the silence of both victims and perpetrators of violence, keeping us stuck in those moments, enabling the same cycles to play out time and time again. My search for my own unknown past is one reason I was so enthralled by the Instituto de Medicina Legal, the forensic lab in El Salvador, a vault of so many untold violent stories. Watching their rituals of forensic recovery led me to believe that unforgetting is a critical way to start the process of individual, familial, and national healing. The power to reconstruct the bones of a person and return them to the family haunted by the disappearance of their loved one enables a critical step towards healing. It's the knowing that their loved one is dead and how he or she died that allows these families to conduct burial rites and mourn. Without this unforgetting, they can have no closure and are held in a terrible limbo. The same applies to reconstructing the bones of our personal and national memories, including the memory of what it is to be American, the identity that has caused so much devastation to those of us who identify as Salvadoran. Being American has taught me that the difficult future before us demands that we set aside the myths and infantile stories we tell ourselves in this country. Being Salvadoreño has taught me about the still urgent need to create the epic, revolutionary sensibility we will need to survive the epic history that awaits us in the best of circumstances. Learning that Pop, my fucking father, is one of the last remaining witnesses of one of the most violent episodes in modern history softened me, not only toward Pop, but toward myself and all Salvadorans. Pop, the man I once considered a coward, I now respect immensely. It took him almost 70 years, but Pop braved the 1,000 darknesses of his past to share the most secret and excruciating part of his and our story with me. Today I am moved by newfound compassion toward Pop to protect him from horrors that at 98 he has earned a reprieve from. Recent news I keep from him include reports of the mass imprisonment of Central American children fleeing violence has helped turn the United States into the world's leading jailer of children. Children like David, whom I met in the Child and Mom prison in Carnes. That was Obama. This news also includes reports that WINSEC, the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, formerly known as the School of the Americas, has started training immigration and customs enforcement officials and the Border Patrol to fight migrant kids and moms as though they actually are an invading army seen in the hallucinations of the powerful. The immigration agencies are training for, quote, urban warfare. Such reports show how the cross-border circuits of counterinsurgency policing, conceived, practiced, and exported by local and federal government agencies in the United States, still keep the eternal cycles of violence spinning. Reading similar reports decades ago is how I first came to understand that the violence in the country of my birth, the United States, is also a violence of apocalyptic proportions. Salvadoran violence is, in no small part, an expression of forgotten American violence. I have tried to sew together the fragments of my life to illustrate how the oblivion itself is violence. Forensic labs like the IML have remembered the dismembered. Mamate sewed scraps into cloths for the forgotten prostitutes of the Maison. People like them seek what I've been sought by stitching together my words here. Unforgetting.
Thank you, Roberto.
Gracias,
Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
No,
It's been an honor.
Oh, igualmente. I also want to thank the folks that make this happen. I thank the camera woman there. There you are. And all of the Kerr Media folk. Of course, Maya Gomez, our associate director, is always making all of this happen. I want to thank my students who also had some questions there and we didn't get to them, but thank you. I know you did your work. And also Stephanie Rubio, our publicist, Mariela Aguilar, program coordinator, all our interns, and Alma Trejo Rodriguez, of course, who helps us show up all the time for this. But Roberto, es que muchas gracias, and we're going to reconvene next 2 weeks from now is Maria Hinojosa, and after that will be Cristina Rivera Garza, and then all four of us, including Luis Rodriguez, and then you and I, so all six of us are going to all come together and have questions for each other. And so,
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, me too. Anyway, muchas gracias a todos, and hasta la próxima.